To the mail-order war. The rifle arrived at Stalag Luft III in a Red Cross package marked Educational Materials, wrapped in oilcloth between copies of Popular Mechanics and a worn Bible. Staff Sergeant Tommy Brennan unwrapped it slowly in the dim light of Block 147, his calloused fingers tracing the cheap wooden stock and mass-produced barrel of what appeared to be a basic .22 caliber training rifle, the kind advertised in the back pages of hunting magazines for $19.95, complete with a simple 4X scope that looked like it came from a Cracker Jack box. "Jesus, Brennan," muttered Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the senior American officer who'd been watching the unpacking with growing skepticism. "What the hell is that supposed to be? A toy gun? The Krauts are going to laugh themselves to death." The other prisoners gathered around the bunk shared Hayes's expression of barely concealed disappointment. They'd been expecting something significant in this carefully orchestrated delivery, perhaps components for a real weapon, or at least something that looked dangerous enough to matter. The spring of 1944 had brought rumors of major operations, whispered conversations about coordinated breakouts, and the kind of desperate hope that made men believe in miracles disguised as Red Cross parcels. But Brennan said nothing as he examined the rifle's action, working the bolt with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of years spent in hunting camps across rural Montana, long before the war had swept him from a tail gunner's position in a burning B-17 into this maze of wire and watchtowers. The other prisoners saw junk. Brennan saw possibility. He'd grown up poor enough to know that the most effective tools rarely looked impressive, and skilled enough to understand that in the right hands, any rifle could be lethal at the distances that mattered inside a prison camp. The barracks fell silent, except for the distant sound of boots on gravel and the ever-present hum of searchlights sweeping the compound. Through the single window, the guard towers of Stalag Luft III rose against the grey Polish sky like mechanical sentinels, each one manned by snipers who'd proven their effectiveness in keeping escape attempts to a minimum. The camp held nearly 10,000 Allied airmen, most of them shot down over German territory during the increasingly desperate bombing campaigns that had characterized the war's latest phase. "You planning to hunt rabbits with that thing?" Captain Morris asked, his voice carrying the kind of forced lightness that masked deeper fears. Morris had been at the camp longer than most, long enough to see what happened to prisoners who tried to run. Brennan finally looked up, his grey eyes meeting Morris's with an expression that seemed to calculate distances and angles. "Something like that," he said quietly. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, the heavy, measured tread that announced a routine inspection. The prisoners moved with practiced efficiency, hiding the rifle components beneath loose floorboards, while arranging themselves in positions that suggested nothing more suspicious than evening conversation. When Obergefreiter Klaus Richter entered with two other guards, they found a scene of perfect normalcy. Tired airmen discussing letters from home and speculating about the war's progress. Richter was a veteran sniper with 16 confirmed kills on the Russian front before a shattered knee had landed him on guard duty at Stalag Luft III. He moved through the barracks with the professional attention of someone who'd learned to notice things others missed, his eyes scanning bunks and faces with equal suspicion. But when his search turned up the rifle, poorly hidden, as if the prisoners hadn't really tried, his expression shifted to something approaching amusement. "American garbage," he announced to his fellow guards, hefting the lightweight weapon as if it might break in his hands. "Mail-order trash. No wonder they are losing the war." The guards examined the rifle with the casual interest of professionals handling amateur equipment. To men accustomed to precision Mauser K98s and optics that cost more than most prisoners' monthly pay, the cheap American rifle represented everything they'd been taught about enemy inferiority. They photographed it for their reports, made notes about the Red Cross delivery system, and ultimately returned it to the prisoners with the same dismissive attitude they might show toward a child's toy. What they didn't understand was that they'd just made the first of several critical mistakes. As the guards departed, Brennan reassembled the rifle with movements so automatic they seemed like meditation. Outside, the searchlights continued their endless patrol, casting moving shadows through the barracks windows. The spring air carried the scent of distant rain and the perpetual smell of coal smoke that marked occupied Europe in 1944. "You really think that thing can make a difference?" Hayes asked quietly. Brennan worked a patch through the barrel, cleaning residue that probably wasn't there. "Colonel, back home in Montana, I've dropped elk at 300 yards with open sights. This scope might not be German precision, but it's clear enough. The weight of that statement settled over the gathering like snow on winter ground. These were men who'd volunteered for bombing missions over heavily defended targets, who'd faced fighter planes and flak clouds with something approaching equanimity. But the idea of systematic, patient killing, of turning their prison camp into a hunting ground, carried implications that made even veteran airmen uncomfortable. "How many guard towers can you see from here?" Brennan asked, his voice carrying the kind of practical curiosity that suggested he'd already been making calculations. Hayes moved to the window, counting silently. 7, maybe 8, if you include the one by the main gate. "And how many men you figure we lose every month trying to get past those towers?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone in Block 147 knew the statistics, though they rarely spoke them aloud. Escape attempts had been growing more sophisticated throughout the spring, but they'd also been growing more costly. 3 prisoners had made it all the way to neutral territory in the past 2 months, but dozens more had been shot while crossing the compound or cut down in the searchlight beams that swept the perimeter every night. "Enough," Hayes said finally. Brennan nodded and continued cleaning the rifle with the kind of methodical attention that spoke of absolute focus. Outside, the guards were changing shifts, a process he'd been observing for 6 weeks with the same patience he'd once used to track game through timber so thick you couldn't see 30 yards. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. Tommy Brennan had been watching the guards for 43 days before the rifle arrived, timing their movements with the same methodical patience he'd learned tracking elk through Montana wilderness. Every morning at 06:30, he positioned himself near the latrine windows where the view encompassed most of the camp's security network. What he saw was a system built on routine, and routine he knew from hunting was vulnerability. Tower 7 went unmanned for exactly 2 minutes during the morning shift change. Sergeant Miller in Tower 3 always looked left before scanning right, a habit that created a predictable blind spot. Tower 12 was staffed by Unteroffizier Steiner, a 22-year-old from Bavaria who spent more time bragging about his marksmanship than actually watching the compound. "You're making notes again," Captain Morris observed, settling beside Brennan at the window. "That's either very smart or very dangerous." "Little of both," Brennan replied, not taking his eyes from Tower 12, where Steiner was lighting his 3rd cigarette of the morning. "Question is whether it's more dangerous than doing nothing." The math was simple enough that even the most optimistic prisoners couldn't ignore it. Stalag Luft III held 9,800 Allied airmen as of the latest count, and the escape rate averaged 3 successful attempts per month against 47 casualties. The numbers got worse when you factored in recapture rates and the increasing desperation of men who'd been caged for years. But Brennan saw something else in those statistics, an enemy security system that depended entirely on elevated positions and superior optics. The German guards had height, visibility, and professional training. What they didn't have was an understanding of how a hunter thought about patient work. "Back home, we had a saying about hunting coyotes," Brennan said, his voice carrying the rhythm of a man thinking aloud. "You don't chase them where they want to go. You wait where they have to be." Morris followed Brennan's gaze toward the guard towers, beginning to understand. And where do they have to be? Same place every day, same time, same pattern. They've got the high ground, but they're predictable as sunrise. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Heinrich Möller, the camp's medical officer, who'd come to inspect a prisoner complaining of stomach troubles. Möller was a different type of German than the guards, older, quieter, with the kind of tired professionalism that suggested he'd seen enough war to understand its costs. He moved through the barracks with efficiency rather than hostility, checking temperatures and asking questions in careful English. Brennan watched him work, noting how the doctor's hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. There were stories about Müller, rumors that he'd been a civilian physician before the war, that he'd lost 2 sons on the Russian front, that he sometimes provided extra medical supplies when the regulations said otherwise. "How long you been at this camp, Doctor?" Brennan asked quietly when Möller reached his bunk. 2 years, 3 months, Möller replied, his accent thick but his English clear. "You have symptoms to report?" "Just wondering if you ever get tired of it. All this." Müller's hands stilled for a moment, and something passed across his face that might have been recognition or warning. "We all have duties, Sergeant. Best to focus on those." After Möller departed, the barracks settled into the strange mixture of boredom and tension that characterized POW life. Men played cards with decks worn soft as cloth, wrote letters that might never reach home, and participated in the elaborate classes that gave the camp its veneer of educational purpose. But underneath the routine, something was shifting. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found Brennan at the window again that afternoon, still observing the guard towers with the focused attention of a man solving a complex problem. "You're planning something," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. "Planning's a strong word, Colonel. I'm just looking at what's there." "And what do you see?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes tracking the movement of guards and searchlights with mathematical precision. "I see 10 towers with good sight lines and professional snipers. I see a security system that's never been seriously challenged by someone who understands long-range shooting. And I see about 3 weeks before the big breakout you and the escape committee have been planning." Hayes stiffened slightly. The escape plans were supposed to be secret, known only to senior officers and a few trusted specialists. "How did you—" "Same way I know Steiner in Tower 12 is left-handed, that Möller in Tower 3 needs glasses but won't wear them on duty, and that Richter's got a bad knee that slows him down when the weather changes. I pay attention." The weight of Brennan's observation settled between them like a stone in deep water. Hayes had been at Stalag Luft III long enough to understand the mathematics of escape attempts. Even the most carefully planned breakouts faced devastating casualties when they tried to cross the compound under sniper fire. The German security system was simple, effective, and seemingly impregnable. "What you're thinking about," Hayes said carefully, "that's not just escape, that's war. War's what got us here, Colonel. Question is whether we're going to fight it or just endure it." Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the compound. In Tower 12, Steiner was settling into position for the evening watch, his rifle resting against the tower's wooden frame with casual confidence. He was young, proud, and absolutely certain of his superiority over the demoralized prisoners below. What he couldn't know was that somewhere in Block 147, a Montana hunter was calculating windage and distance with the same methodical precision he'd once used to feed his family during the worst years of the Depression. The cheap rifle might look like mail-order trash, but in the right hands it could reach 240 yards with enough accuracy to change everything. The first morning came grey and cold, with visibility reduced to barely 200 yards by ground fog that rolled across the compound like smoke from a grass fire. Brennan had positioned himself in the workshop behind Block 147. using a hole that had been carefully enlarged over several weeks to appear like routine damage from expanding wood. At exactly 6:47 a.m., and as the guards were changing shifts and attention was focused on the administrative areas near the main gate, he settled into position with the mail-order rifle. Through the cheap scope, Unteroffizier Steiner appeared as a dark silhouette against the grey sky of Tower 12. For 17 minutes, Brennan watched him through the crosshairs, timing his movements, learning his patterns. Steiner had a habit of checking his watch every few minutes, of adjusting his collar when the wind picked up, of turning to light cigarettes with his back to the compound. When Steiner turned to light that cigarette at 7:04 a.m., presenting his profile against the morning sky, Brennan squeezed the trigger with the kind of smooth, steady pressure that comes from years of practice with weapons that don't forgive jerky movements. The .22 bullet crossed 240 yards in silence, and Steiner simply disappeared into his tower. The small caliber meant almost no muzzle flash, and a report quiet enough to be mistaken for a door slamming or a piece of equipment being dropped. By the time other guards realized something was wrong, Brennan had already moved to a new position in the latrine area, where gaps between boards provided a different angle on Tower 9. What followed over the next 3 days would become the most systematic counter-sniping operation in the camp's history. Obergefreiter Weber died at 11:23 a.m., caught as he bent over to retrieve a dropped magazine. Gefreiter Hoffmann followed at 2:15 p.m., drawn into the open by a carefully staged disturbance that other prisoners had organized to mask the sound of Brennan's movements. By evening, 3 guard towers were unmanned, and the camp's security had developed gaps that made the German command structure nervous in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Inside the barracks, the reaction was mixed. Some prisoners spoke in hushed, excited whispers about the mysterious sniper who was systematically eliminating their guards. Others worried about reprisals, about collective punishment that might fall on the entire camp. But Lieutenant Colonel Hayes noticed something else: the careful way Brennan cleaned his rifle each evening, working patches through the barrel with movements so automatic they seemed like meditation. "How many?" Hayes asked quietly on the morning of the 3rd day, though he'd been keeping count through the prisoner network that tracked German casualties with the same precision they applied to escape planning. 7 so far, Brennan replied, not looking up from his cleaning routine. 3 more today should do it, enough to clear the sightlines for the big breakout anyway. Their replacements won't know the patterns yet, and the ones who survive will be too scared to be effective. The psychological impact was becoming more significant than the tactical advantage. Men who'd been confident in their elevated positions and superior equipment were beginning to understand that somewhere in the compound below, an invisible American was hunting them with methodical precision, using a weapon that looked like mail-order trash, but functioned with deadly efficiency. Requests for transfer began appearing on the commandant's desk. Night shifts became exercises in pure terror as guards huddled below the sightlines of their own towers. Doctor, Muller noticed the change during his afternoon rounds. The German guards, who usually accompanied him through the barracks, were jumpy, distracted, constantly checking over their shoulders. When he paused at Brennan's bunk to check on a supposedly sprained wrist, the American's hands were steady as stone. "You seem calm for someone in the middle of such excitement," Muller observed in his careful English. "Doc, back in Montana, excitement was when the elk didn't show up where you expected them. This is just work." Muller studied Brennan's face for a long moment, and something passed between them that might have been understanding or warning. "Work can be dangerous, Sergeant, for everyone involved. Most worthwhile things are." That afternoon brought news that changed the camp's entire dynamic. Captain Morrison burst into Block 147 with a letter that had somehow made it through censorship, bearing news from the European front that contradicted everything they'd been told about the war's progress. "Allied forces landed in Normandy 6 weeks ago," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the barracks like electricity. "According to my brother, we've got more than 150,000 troops on French soil, and the Germans are falling back on every front." The letter passed from hand to hand, each man reading the cramped handwriting that described massive amphibious assaults, coordinated air operations, and German defensive lines that were crumbling faster than their propaganda admitted. For prisoners who'd been told repeatedly that American forces were being decimated in Italy and that the Reich's ultimate victory was inevitable, the news carried the force of revelation. "If this is true," Hayes said quietly, "then everything they've been telling us about the war is bullshit," Brennan finished. "Which means every day we spend in here is a day we're not helping finish this thing." The 8th Guard died at 10:30 a.m. the next day. Gefreiter Baumann, caught against the skyline as he tried to use binoculars to scan the compound. The 9th fell at 1:45 p.m. and the 10th at 4:17 p.m. And just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade and create the kind of visibility conditions that favored a hidden shooter over exposed targets in guard towers. By evening, the camp's sniper defense had been systematically dismantled by one American with a mail-order rifle that had cost less than what the Germans paid for a single precision scope. The mathematical precision of it was almost beautiful in its simplicity. 10 towers, 10 guards, 3 days of patient work. But as Brennan cleaned his rifle that final evening, working the barrel with strips torn from an old shirt and oil carefully hoarded from kitchen supplies, he found himself thinking about the young faces he'd seen through the scope. Steiner had been 22, barely old enough to shave properly. Weber had carried a photograph of a girl who might have been his sister or sweetheart. They'd been following orders, doing their duty, probably believing they were the good guys. The war had taught him to kill, but Montana had taught him to respect what he killed. The contradiction sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy and indigestible. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home? Or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The breakout began 3 weeks later, just as Brennan had predicted. 76 prisoners made it out of the compound in the largest escape attempt in the camp's history, slipping through sight lines that should have been covered by experienced snipers, but were now manned by nervous replacements who flinched at shadows. Most were recaptured within days, but the psychological impact on German morale was devastating enough to justify the entire operation. What the other prisoners didn't understand was the cost of those 3 days in ways that couldn't be measured in tactical advantages or successful escapes. Brennan had stopped sleeping properly. He'd lie on his bunk, staring at the ceiling while other men snored around him, his mind replaying the moment when each guard had fallen. In the darkness, he could hear their voices. Steiner bragging about his marksmanship, Weber asking about mail from home, Hoffman sharing photographs of his family. They'd been young men far from home, following orders in a war they probably didn't understand any better than he did. Dr. Mueller noticed the change during his weekly rounds. When he checked Brennan's blood pressure, the readings were elevated in ways that suggested chronic stress rather than immediate illness. "You're not sleeping," the doctor observed. It wasn't a question. "Sleep's overrated, Doc." Mueller sat on the edge of the bunk, abandoning his usual clinical distance. "I have treated many soldiers, Sergeant, in Russia, in Poland, now here. The ones who cannot sleep, they carry ghosts." "And what's your prescription for ghosts?" "Time, understanding, sometimes forgiveness." "Which one do you recommend?" Mueller was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap like a man in prayer. "I lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front. They were not much older than some of the boys who are no longer in the towers." The admission hung between them like smoke in still air. Brennan studied the doctor's face, noting the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried permanent tension. "I'm sorry for your loss," Brennan said quietly. War makes murderers of us all, Sergeant. The only question is whether we remember we are still human afterward. That afternoon, Brennan found himself in the camp workshop, ostensibly helping to repair broken furniture, but actually trying to avoid the looks of admiration from other prisoners. Word had spread about his role in the tower eliminations, and men had begun treating him with the kind of reverent respect reserved for heroes. They wanted to shake his hand, to hear details about the shots, to bask in the reflected glory of successful resistance. But sitting at the workbench, running a plane over rough wood, Brennan found himself thinking about Weber's photograph. The girl had been blonde, maybe 18, with the kind of smile that suggested she believed in happy endings. She was probably still waiting for letters that would never come, still believing that her soldier would return from his duty assignment at a prisoner-of-war camp where nothing dangerous ever happened. "Brennan," Captain Morris called from across the workshop, "Hayes wants to see you in his quarters, says it's important." The senior officers' quarters were a step up from regular barracks. A private room with a desk, a few books, and the kind of authority that came with rank and responsibility. Hayes was studying a map when Brennan arrived, measuring distances with a broken ruler and making notes in careful handwriting. "Close the door," Hayes said, without looking up. "We need to talk about what happens next." Next? The war's changing, Sergeant. If the intelligence from Normandy is accurate, the Germans could be facing collapse within months. When that happens, camps like this become complicated. Hayes turned from the map, his expression carrying the weight of command decisions that kept men awake at night. "There's going to be an investigation after the war. Allied intelligence will want to know everything about escape attempts, resistance activities, collaboration. They'll want names, dates, detailed accounts of every operation." Brennan understood immediately. "And they'll want to know about the towers. 10 dead guards in 3 days, using a weapon delivered through Red Cross channels. That's not just resistance, Sergeant. That's systematic assassination using humanitarian aid as cover. The kind of thing that gets people tried for war crimes." The workshop sounds, hammering, sawing, the low murmur of conversation, seemed to fade into background static. Brennan found himself thinking about Weber's photograph again, about Steiner's mother, who would never know exactly how her son died, about official reports that would classify their deaths as combat casualties without mentioning the mail-order rifle or the Montana hunter who'd used it. "What are you asking me to do, Colonel?" "I'm asking you to think carefully about what story you want to tell when the investigators come calling. Because they will come calling, and what you say could determine whether you go home a hero or spend the rest of your life in a different kind of prison." That evening, Brennan sat by the window watching the replacement guards in their towers. They were older men, mostly. Veterans pulled from other duties to fill positions that had suddenly become high-risk assignments. They moved carefully, constantly checking their surroundings, never presenting themselves as clear targets. His work had changed them, made them afraid in ways that would probably last long after the war ended. Lieutenant Morrison joined him at the window, settling into companionable silence. They watched the searchlights sweep the compound, listened to the distant sound of aircraft engines, and contemplated the strange mathematics of survival in a world where everyone was both predator and prey. "You ever think about going home?" Morrison asked eventually. "Every day. What'll you tell people about all this?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes tracking the nervous movements of guards who no longer felt safe in their elevated positions. "I'll tell them I was a prisoner of war who followed orders and tried to survive. Everything else is just details." Outside, the Polish winter was beginning to hint at its arrival, bringing shorter days and longer nights. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder, a reminder that the war continued beyond the wire and watchtowers of Stalag Luft the Thirst. The secret wasn't hidden in the rifle itself, but in the worn Bible that had arrived with it in that Red Cross package. Brennan discovered it 3 weeks after the tower operations, when he was using the book's thin pages to clean residual oil from the rifle's action. Pressed between the pages of Ecclesiastes were documents that changed everything he thought he understood about his mission. They were photocopied pages from German intelligence reports detailing Allied bombing accuracy rates, prisoner survival statistics, and something that made his blood run cold. Detailed psychological profiles of American airmen identified as potential assets for special operations behind enemy lines. His own name was on the list. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan, B-17 tail gunner, shot down over Bremen, November 1943. The notation beside his name read, "Rural background, advanced marksmanship skills, psychological profile indicates adaptability to isolated operations, recommended for Project Moonlight." The papers revealed what the mail-order rifle really was. Not a desperate gesture from Allied intelligence, but the first phase of a systematic program to turn captured airmen into assassins. The cheap appearance, the dismissive reaction from guards, even the Red Cross packaging, all of it had been carefully calculated to create the precise scenario that had unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found Brennan sitting at his bunk that evening, the documents spread before him like cards in a game he'd never agreed to play. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered, scanning the intelligence summaries. "They planned this, all of it. Down to the guard rotation schedules and tower sight lines," Brennan confirmed, his voice empty of emotion. "Those documents include detailed maps of the camp, psychological profiles of German personnel, even weather patterns for optimal shooting conditions." Hayes studied the papers with the growing horror of a man realizing he'd been played by his own side. The escape attempt, the timing, the whole operation was designed to succeed because I eliminated the sniper threat. And I eliminated the sniper threat because they sent me a weapon and made sure I had every piece of information I needed to use it effectively. The implications settled over them like ash from a distant fire. The 76 men who'd escaped, the dozens who'd been recaptured, the psychological impact on German camp security, all of it had been choreographed by Allied intelligence officers who'd treated their own personnel as expendable assets in a larger strategic game. Steiner, Weber, Hoffman, Brennan continued, reading names from the intelligence profiles. They have detailed information on all of them, personal histories, family backgrounds, psychological weaknesses. They knew exactly who they were asking me to kill. And they knew you'd do it. Yeah, they knew I'd do it. Dr. Muller appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous conversations. His presence wasn't coincidence. Nothing in the camp was ever coincidence anymore. "Sergeant Brennan, I need to check your medical status for the weekly report." But when Mueller bent to examine Brennan's supposed injuries, he slipped a small piece of paper into the American's hand. Written in careful English was a single line: "Some of us were never supposed to survive this war." Brennan looked up at the doctor, understanding passing between them like current through wire. Mueller had known about Project Moonlight, had probably been feeding information to Allied intelligence for months, trading medical intelligence about German personnel for promises that might never be kept. "How long have you been working with them?" Brennan asked quietly. "Since my sons died in Russia," Mueller replied. "They promised me safe passage to American lines when the war ends, for my wife and daughter." "And what did you promise them?" "Detailed medical and psychological profiles of German camp personnel, information about guard rotations, health problems, personal weaknesses, everything they needed to make your mission successful." The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of searchlights and the ever-present murmur of 10,000 men trying to survive captivity. Hayes stared at the intelligence documents, as if they might spontaneously combust, while Brennan found himself thinking about the weight of the rifle in his hands and the way Steiner's cigarette had glowed against the morning sky. "There's more," Muller said, his voice barely above a whisper. Project Moonlight was a test case. If successful, they plan to implement similar operations at camps throughout occupied Europe. Hundreds of weapons, thousands of targets. And if unsuccessful, then the personnel involved become classified casualties, missing in action, presumed dead. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. Allied intelligence had identified American prisoners with specific skill sets, provided them with weapons and intelligence, and created scenarios where their success would advance strategic objectives. If they succeeded, the operations could be expanded. If they failed or were exposed, they could be disavowed as unauthorized resistance activities. Either way, the prisoners involved were expendable. Brennan folded the intelligence documents with careful precision, his movements carrying the same methodical attention he'd once applied to cleaning weapons and timing shots. But something had changed in his face, a hardening around the eyes that spoke of truths too heavy to carry easily. "Colonel," he said to Hayes, "remember that conversation about what story I'd tell the investigators?" "Yeah, I've decided." Outside, the replacement guards continued their nervous patrol of the towers, unaware that their predecessors had died not as casualties of prisoner desperation, but as test subjects in a psychological experiment designed to measure the effectiveness of turning captured Americans into government-sanctioned killers. The cheap rifle still lay on Brennan's bunk, its mail-order appearance hiding the precision engineering that had made it so effective at distances up to 300 yards. But now it looked different to him. Not like a tool of survival or resistance, but like evidence of a crime he'd been carefully manipulated into committing. In 3 days, Allied investigators would arrive to debrief prisoners about escape attempts and resistance activities. And Tommy Brennan would have to decide whether to tell them about Project Moonlight or to bury the truth as deeply as the intelligence officers who designed it clearly intended. The Allied investigators arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, just as the Polish countryside was surrendering to winter's first serious assault. They came in clean uniforms with clipboards and stenographers, conducting formal debriefings in rooms that still smelled of disinfectant and defeat. For 3 days, they documented escape attempts, resistance activities, and collaboration cases with the methodical efficiency of men who understood that history would judge their thoroughness. When they called Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan for his interview, he carried nothing but the worn Bible that had arrived months earlier in a Red Cross package. The intelligence documents were gone, burned in a workshop stove, along with the careful notes he'd made about guard rotations and shooting angles. Some secrets, he'd decided, were too dangerous to survive. "Sergeant Brennan," began Major Phillips, the lead investigator, "you were identified by multiple prisoners as being involved in resistance activities that resulted in German casualties. Can you describe your role in these operations?" Brennan sat quietly for a moment, his hands folded in his lap with the same stillness he'd learned during long hours watching game trails in Montana wilderness. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat neutrality of a man who'd measured his words carefully. "I was a prisoner of war, Major. I followed orders from senior officers and tried to survive my captivity according to military regulations. Prisoners report that you eliminated multiple German guards using a rifle delivered through humanitarian channels. That's a serious allegation, Sergeant." "Prisoners report a lot of things, sir. Doesn't make them all true." The interrogation continued for 2 hours, with Phillips and his team pressing for details about weapons, targets, and operational planning. But Brennan's answers remained consistent. He'd been a prisoner following orders. Nothing more. When they showed him photographs of the rifle, he identified it as Red Cross educational materials. When they asked about his marksmanship training, he mentioned hunting experience, but denied using those skills against camp personnel. The final question came from Colonel Anderson, Phillips's superior, who'd been taking notes throughout the session. "Sergeant, You understand that withholding information about war crimes could make you complicit in those crimes? Yes, sir. I understand that. And you're certain you have nothing to add to your statement? Nothing at all, sir. When the debriefing ended, Brennan walked out of Stalag Luft III for the last time, carrying his few possessions in a canvas bag that smelled of disinfectant and disappointment. The mail-order rifle remained behind, classified as enemy material and destined for destruction. He never saw it again. Dr. Mueller had been transferred 3 weeks earlier, his destination listed as administrative reassignment. Whether he'd received the safe passage promised by Allied intelligence remained unknown. The doctor's last message, passed through another prisoner, had been simple: some ghosts choose to stay quiet. The transport truck carried 47 former prisoners toward processing centers in France, men who'd survived months or years in captivity and were now facing the complex challenge of returning to a world that had continued without them. They compared stories, shared contact information, and made promises to stay in touch that most of them knew they probably wouldn't keep. But 27 years later, military historian Dr. James Patterson would discover Brennan's story, buried in classified debriefings and prisoner testimonies that had been sealed until long after the war's end. Cross-referencing German camp records with American intelligence files, Patterson would spend months trying to verify details of operations that officially had never existed. His final conclusion, published in a limited academic journal that few people read, was that one man with a cheap rifle had accomplished more for Allied morale and German demoralization than entire bombing campaigns directed at similar targets. But the human cost of that success, Patterson noted, remained incalculable. Brennan returned to Montana in the spring of 1945, resuming work at the lumber mill where he'd been employed before the war. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and resumed hunting elk in the same mountains where he'd learned to judge distance and windage with deadly precision. But those who knew him noticed changes. He never again used a scope while hunting, relying instead on open sights that limited his effective range to distances where he could see his target's face clearly. He never spoke of hunting in terms of sport, treating it instead as practical necessity, meat for the table, nothing more. And he never told war stories, even when pressed by friends who wanted to hear about his experiences as a prisoner. The only evidence of his wartime service was the worn Bible he kept on his nightstand, its pages thin from handling and marked with passages he'd underlined in pencil. Ecclesiastes 3:3 was highlighted in faded ink: a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. On quiet evenings, when the Montana wind carried the scent of snow from distant peaks, neighbors sometimes saw him standing on his porch with that Bible in his hands, reading passages by lamplight like a man searching for answers to questions he could never speak aloud. The rifle that others had mocked as mail-order trash had proven that the most effective weapons are often the ones enemies dismiss as harmless. But it had also proven something else: that in the right hands, anything can become deadly enough to change the course of battles that matter, and that truth, once learned, never fully leaves the hands that learned it. Tommy Brennan died in 1987, taking his secrets with him. At his funeral, veterans from 3 different wars honored a man they knew as a prisoner of war, who'd served with distinction and returned home to build a quiet, decent life. None of them knew about Project Moonlight, about intelligence documents hidden in a Bible, or about 10 German guards who died in service of an experiment their own commanders had never authorized. The mail-order rifle had disappeared into the chaos of advancing Allied armies, probably discarded as worthless by soldiers who couldn't recognize what it had accomplished. But its legacy lived on in classified files, in academic papers that few people read, and in the dreams of an old hunter who'd learned that some targets, once taken, never stop watching you through the crosshairs of memory. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How do we reconcile the duties we're given with the truths we discover along the way?